Hey everyone, I'm Ben Norton, and this is the Multipolarista podcast. Today I'm joined by a good friend of the show, a Venezuelan journalist named Jesús Rodríguez Espinoza. He is the editor of one of my favorite websites. It's called the Orinoco Tribune. I would highly recommend people checking it out at orinocotribune.com. It is a great resource for coverage of Latin America in English. And Jesus has a lot of translations of Spanish language articles into English that don't get coverage in the English language media. So definitely check out his work. I wanted to bring on Jesus today to get a Venezuelan's perspective on a few issues, but especially I wanted to get his response to the election in Colombia. Now, I have another video and another podcast. It's around 20 minutes. It's shorter, about the historic election on June 19th in Colombia. For the first time in Colombia's history, a left-wing candidate won the presidential election. Gustavo Petro will be the next president of Colombia. He is a former guerrilla in a socialist militia. He later put down his arms and he moved kind of toward the center-left politically. He's much more moderate, but he's a progressive. And in the context of Colombia, he's seen as someone who's very radical because Colombia has never had a left-wing government. It has always been right-wing. So if you want to check out the other video/podcast, you can get a more detailed analysis. I talked about the many problems that Petro will be facing, including the fact that he doesn't have a majority in the Congress, which is still dominated by the right wing. The military has threatened him. Paramilitary groups have threatened him. And in Colombia, every single year, hundreds of social movement activists are killed. In every year, there are nearly 100 massacres. So I talked about all of those issues, and I analyzed the situation in Colombia in another video. In this video, in this live stream, I am interviewing Jesus to get a Venezuelan Chavista's perspective on it. Jesus supports the leftist Chavista movement and the Bolivarian Revolution. And especially, I wanted to get an idea of what Petro's victory could mean for Colombia's neighbor, Venezuela, and also the region, for Latin America as a whole. Of course, Colombia has been a key U.S. proxy waging this hybrid war on Venezuela, launching cross-border attacks, including terrorist attacks in Venezuela, backing the U.S. blockade and sanctions. Colombia still recognizes Juan Guaido, this U.S. coup puppet, as fake president of Venezuela. And Petro, although he has made a lot of ridiculous comments condemning Venezuela and Nicaragua, Petro has also promised to normalize relations with Venezuela, recognizing the only real constitutional president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro. So without further ado, Jesus, what do you think about Gustavo Petro's victory in Colombia? What is your perspective as a Venezuelan and a Chavista?
I believe, as you say, that is. I mean, we are excited. I sleep nice yesterday thinking that Petro won the elections in Colombia. But as you said, I mean, one have to be careful with the level of leftism that Petro will exercise now being president, because one thing is being in the opposition, being a you know a politician, a senator, opposing the right wing governments in Colombia. But the other thing is like to be president and try to fulfill what he promised for several years. So that's going to be the hard part, especially in a country plagued with violence, as you said, with paramilitary, with military. Uh, mm, Caste controlling the country, with the U.S., all over the country, trying to use it, because I believe that's the main objective of U.S. foreign policy towards Colombia, is basically to use it as a source of drugs, and then also to use it as a beachhead for their Washington's warmongering policies towards the region and disruption policies towards the left in the region. So I believe that Petro's going to have to deal with that. And yesterday I was participating in a live broadcast with people from the Alliance for Global Justice, and I asked James Jordan, which is one of their members that is more active in Colombia. I asked him about what he believed under these circumstances would be the first step that Petro should take, and he told me that under these circumstances, the first thing that Petro should do is try to build the peace agreements, to resume them, to try to approach and comply with everything that was agreed under the peace agreement signed in 2016 between the FARC and the Colombian government. That was during the time of the previous president. I forgot his name, the owner of El Tiempo. I don't remember his name, but anyway,
Pastrana?
no, no, the other guy. They actually the guy that proposed Ivan Duque, but then break with him.
Santos?
Exactly, Juan Manuel
Santos.
Santos. Juan Manuel Santos, yes. So I believe that that's a nice approach towards towards the how what to do under Colombians reality. I mean, trying to comply with the peace agreement signed in 2016 seems to be like the easiest way to advance in his agenda. But as you say, he's gonna have to deal with a lot of counter currents. I mean, not having control over the Congress will means that he's going to be forced to reach alliances with right-wing forces, because I believe that leftist forces outside Pacto Histórico, which is his political group party, won't allow him to have 50% of the Congress in Colombia. So I believe that many analysts also believe that he's gonna be forced to reach agreements with some people in the center. Even some people say that he will reach agreements with some people from the right. But anyway, we need to see what's going to happen in that sense. But we are happy. We're happy. We believe that at least having, I see Gustavo Petro as a center, or maybe center left, maybe politicians. He's very seen in Colombia already, despite the criticism from the right wingers that say that he's a guerrilla man and that he's a communist and blah blah blah. He's seen by many, most part of Colombian society, as a traditional politician. This was his third attempt to running as a presidential candidate, and a lot of people in Colombia see him like part of the status quo, disregarding that he's from the left. So it's gonna be hard for him to reach uh, progressive uh, to take progressive decisions, and that maybe will put him in a similar situation as Gabriel Boric, for example, in Chile, or Pedro Castillo in Peru. I mean, they're gonna be Pedro Castillo. I feel that is maybe a little bit different. I believe that he's being forced to not be as progressive as he really wants to be. But in the case of Boric, I believe that he's just that. I mean, a liberal that is trying to portray himself as a leftist, and I believe that Petro is have some similarities with Boric, and yesterday we were preparing a piece about the congratulatory messages that Petro received yesterday at night, and one of the most excited, happy, is, I don't know how to say it, message that he received was from Gabriel Boric, the president of Chile. So anyway, I believe that we have to pay attention to that, because he's gonna have to reach alliances and he's also gonna have to try to contain U.S. aggression that is always gonna be there, and they are not going to allow too much independence in Colombia. So let's see what happened in that sense. But now going to the Venezuelan side, we are excited because the level of uh, worsening of the bilateral relations between Colombia and Venezuela since 2018, 2019 has been the worst in our Republican history. I mean, we don't have diplomatic relations with Colombia. We don't have consular relations with Colombia. We don't have um, uh, trade relations with Colombia. Recently, in recent months, since January and February, some easing of that trade relation has been happening, but it's not an open trade relation that like the one that we had before 2019. And I say 2019 because 2019 is the year when the US launched the crazy Guaido project, and immediately after the US recognized Guaido as president, when he self-appointed himself as interim president of Venezuela, breaking all the laws. uh, uh, Immediately after the U.S. recognized that, Colombia went through and also did the same, and they immediately, a few weeks later, launched this crazy forced entry of humanitarian, so-called humanitarian aid to Venezuela, towards Venezuela from the border in Cucuta, and that was a big military security situation that we had to face. I'm talking about February 23rd, if I remember well, 2019. That day, uh, President Maduro decided to break economic and consular relations with Colombia. And it's absolutely understandable because they were basically becoming the beachhead for U.S. military approach towards intervening in Venezuela, and that was the least that Maduro could do under those circumstances. But 3 years have already passed, and the situation is every day worse and worse for Colombians living in Venezuela, and we have a lot of Colombians living in Venezuela, like 5 or 6 million are the calculations, and also for Venezuelans that has been emigrating in recent years to Colombia, and some people talk about 1.5 or 2 million Venezuelans living in Colombia right now. So without consulates, that the life of those people is a mess. It's a nightmare because you need to, for example, yesterday during the elections, 129,000 Colombians residents from Venezuela are registered to vote. And yesterday, and that happened also on May 29, when the second round of the first round of the elections happened in Colombia. There were problems in the border with Venezuela because the Colombian government deployed voting centers nearby the crossing post, the border with Venezuela, to allegedly to allow Colombians living in Venezuela to vote. They don't say that it's very expensive to mobilize currently within Venezuela because we still have gas problems in the country. They don't talk about the security problems, how expensive it is to pay for a bus ticket or an air ticket to go from the east of Venezuela or the south of Venezuela to Cucuta. We're talking about several hundreds of dollars, and a lot of people don't have money to do that. Or time to do that. So, in the first round of the presidential elections in Colombia, only I was reading in Colombia's newspapers, somewhere around 3,000, only 3,000 Colombians managed to vote in the 6 different voting centers that they deployed in the border with Venezuela. Uh, Out of 129,000. And besides that, I mean, that says a lot about how hard for the Colombian living in Venezuela was to vote for in the presidential elections. But also in the border, there were crashes with the Colombian police and the Venezuelan National Guard because they do this crazy scene of closing the border, not only with Venezuela, but with all the countries whenever they have presidential elections in Colombia. So that creates some uncertainty because the people that are registered to vote and that might wanted to vote, they read that the border is closed and they don't know that there is an exception for them to allow them to, cross the border, yes, to vote and go back to Venezuela. But that created this kind of skirmishes, crashes between Colombians in the border wanting to vote, crashing with the Venezuelan National Guard or with the Colombian police, and that was a problem. So I mean, I just wanted to highlight that because that's part of the problems that we have with Colombia, and we hope that Petro will change that. And he was one of the most active candidates that talk very clear about resuming diplomatic and consular relations and trade relations with Venezuela. And we hope that he will fast, because that's something that can be done very fast, uh, accomplish his promise. I mean, fulfill his promise, and that will be good for Venezuela and for Colombia. A lot of people in the north, outside Venezuela, leftist friends, believe that that's not good. That we should, keep the Colombians away because they are a threat. But the reality is that our two countries are too complementary, too interlinked. That is not a good thing to have the levels of breaking relations that we have right now with Colombia. So we know and we are aware that opening trade and commercial and I mean, diplomatic and consular relations might be a threat, but it is also it has also a positive side. So we hope it from Venezuela that might help us, not only in Venezuela, but also in the Colombian side. A lot of people in the border with Venezuela that relied on the trade with Venezuela, on open relations with Venezuela, has been dreaming for several years or months to the resumption of the diplomatic and trade relations. So let's see what happens.
Yeah, I
I don't
think
want to
you.
talk more.
Yeah, I think you made some of the most important points, which is that right now the relations between Venezuela and Colombia could not be worse. I mean, there are no formal diplomatic relations. Colombia has backed numerous terrorist attacks on Venezuela, including in May 2020, there was the botched invasion, Operation Gideon, that was not only backed by the US government and overseen by the CIA, but it was also supported by the Colombian government. Jordan Goudreau, the U.S. Army Special Operations Officer who oversaw the invasion, he trained forces in northern Colombia, and then they crossed from Colombia into Venezuela to launch the attack. And there have been other cross-border attacks. So, I mean, going from a president, Ivan Duque, who is closely linked to drug cartels and death squads, who refuses to recognize the Venezuelan government, who launches cross-border terrorist attacks, to a new president who certainly is not going to be a friend of Venezuela. Petro has made a lot of ridiculous criticisms of Venezuela, but he is going to normalize relations. He's going to stop the terrorist attacks. I mean, it's very easy to see why the Venezuelan government is welcoming this, and I'll just briefly show here that President Maduro released a statement on Twitter congratulating Gustavo Petro and his vice president, Francia Marquez. I want to talk about her in a second because her politics are even better than Petro. She is a former domestic worker from the Afro-Colombian community. She's an activist from the social movements in Colombia. And, Maduro said that the will of the Colombian people was heard. They went out to defend the path toward democracy and peace. And then here's a statement from the new foreign minister of Venezuela, Carlos Faria. And in this, they say that the Bolivarian government of Venezuela expresses its firm will of working and building a renewed stage of integral relations for the well-being of the nation. So this is a clear sign that the Venezuelan government is welcoming this. They now are going to be able to normalize diplomatic relations. So I'm curious what you think this means for the left. We talked about what it means for Venezuela. You are also a Chavista. You're active in building solidarity with other left-wing forces in Latin America. What does this mean for the left? Because when Gabriel Boric was elected, I wrote and I did videos arguing a particular analysis that some people in the US were very angry about, although a lot of people in Latin America agreed with me, that the idea of the pink tide is very simplistic. The idea that all of these, left-wing and progressive leaders are part of this common movement is in some ways not true. In some ways, I see that the Latin American left has been kind of divided into two different paths. And we see that there's the path of the ALBA, which is the revolutionary anti-imperialist path led by Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. And then there's this new kind of social democratic progressive left, which we see with Alberto Fernandez in Argentina, who's really a kind of centrist or center-left, with Gabriel Boric in Chile, and now we see with Petro in Colombia. Pedro Castillo is kind of a more complex figure. His party, Perú Libre, is more aligned, at least the leader of the party is more aligned with the revolutionary forces, but then Pedro Castillo has been unable to govern and has kind of governed as more of a center-left figure. So I'm curious if you agree with that kind of division within the left and what you think this means. Is Petro's victory going to be a way to help to overcome that growing divide in the left, or do you think it's going to make the divisions in the Latin American left even worse?
That's a good point. Let me stop a little bit on Francia Marquez before jumping to your question, because when you mentioned her, I remember something that I was thinking yesterday before going to sleep, and it was that I believe that Francia Marquez actually make the difference, that allowed Petro to win these elections. I mean, Petro won with, at least under the fast counting process that happened yesterday, with 3%. And I'm pretty sure that 3% was reflected by Colombian woman, Colombian Afro-descendant people, poor Colombians that might not be sympathetic to Petro because they see him maybe as another politician from the status quo, but they supported Francia Marquez. So I believe that some part of the victory relies in Francia Marquez. Some people also commented that it might be also the result of all the missteps of Rodolfo Hernandez, the candidate of the opposition, and of the status quo, I mean, in Colombia. But I believe that Francia Marquez's own ways have a lot to do with Petro's victory. Now, jumping to the question of Latin America and the left, and how I see Petro behaving within that environment. I try to be optimistic most of the time, and in this case, I believe that, as you said, Petro is going to be more inclined, more aligned with Gabriel Boric and Alberto Fernandez. But taking into consideration his background, his political background, before becoming a status quo politician of Colombia, I still have hopes that maybe he will try to be like building bridges between that liberal left that we have in the region and the more progressive one represented, as you say, by Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Venezuela. And actually, also, I see a lot of sympathies between the Bolivian president and Petro. I believe that, that there might be some possibilities to try to avoid a split in that very complex pink tide that you were talking about, because some people call it pink tide as an easy way to talk about the left movement in the region, and that might lead that possible scenario of alliances might push the region back towards real progressive, not progressive, real unity projects like UNASUR, as you mentioned, like CELAC, and and those projects were destroyed when the right wingers took control of many countries in the region a few years ago, and they, following U.S. Orders, decided to bombard it, to destroy the UNASUR and CELAC. UNASUR is almost destroyed, but a lot of people, at least here in Venezuela, has been talking about the real possibility of resuming the work of UNASUR. And CELAC has been active, not as active as during the Chavez time and Lula time and Fidel time, but has been alive. Actually, President Alberto Fernandez from Argentina in the failed U.S. Summit of the Americas made a nice speech, and he did it as a speaker for CELAC. I believe that his speech was more as a speaker of CELAC than as president of Argentina. CELAC has been there, and I believe that is the perfect environment right now, with Petro winning as president in Colombia, and with the real possibility of Lula becoming president of Brazil this October in the presidential elections. Will be, there will be a real chance for the region to have CELAC back again with more strength, and that's important because CELAC is almost the same scene as the OAS, but without US and Canada. And that's very important because US and Canada has been always within the regional bodies, just pushing their agendas of exploitation, imperialism, and subjugation of our people. So I hope that might be what happened in the coming years. As I told you, I'm optimistic, but I know what you're talking about Petro. I mean, there's a lot of people especially in the left, thinking that Petro is gonna be just another Gabriel Boric, and that's gonna be very bad because Gabriel Boric is doing weird things, like going to the Summit of the Americas and to Canada to talk about human rights, and how bad Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua are on human rights, while at the same time having the south of Chile militarized under a state of exception, almost on civil war with the Mapuche people that are already tired of having their land, taken away from them by corporations and private, businesses. And he's just repeating the same logic implemented by all Chilean previous presidents towards the Mapuche people. So let's see what happened.
Yeah, and I think you made a good point about the possibility that, although certainly Petro has moderated his political message, he still might have the seeds of the revolutionary that he used to be when he was young. I mean, I'll just mention for people who don't know, Jesus was obliquely referencing the fact that Petro was a member of an armed socialist organization, M19. He was a guerrilla, but he later put down his arms and he moderated his politics. So, I mean, we'll see. There's a possibility that this could have been a long game, that he moderated his politics, but he secretly still has that revolutionary inside of him. Well, I do want to switch topics, Jesus, and talk about sanctions and also Iran. But one more question about Colombia before we transition, and that was about Francia Marquez. So you mentioned that her being Petro's vice president in his left-wing coalition, which is called the Pacto Histórico, which is a very broad coalition of 24 left-wing parties, ranging from liberals and social democrats to the communist parties. So there's a very, very wide tent there, and it's going to be very difficult for them to come to a common consensus on governing. It's easy to unify the left against the right, but actually governing is going to be another question. So anyway, that aside, I agree with you that him choosing Francia Marquez was an important factor in his victory. She represents the Afro-Colombian community. She's an activist. She's not a politician like Petro. She comes from the social movements. And also, I would say that if you look at the statements she's made about Venezuela and other countries in the region, she hasn't engaged in the same kind of red baiting that Petro is. I mean, Petro has, for instance, he's attacked Venezuela and Nicaragua, calling them supposed dictatorships, which is ridiculous. She hasn't engaged in the same rhetoric. And I think, honestly, she's pretty down with a more revolutionary left-wing project, something like, Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution. So it's going to be interesting to see how those two forces are working in the same government. Petro, who represents the more center-left political class that compromises in a lot of things, and Francia Marquez, who represents the social movements who are more interested in radical change. I'm just curious what you think about her possibility as vice president. And my concern is that she could end up like Cristina Fernández de Kirchner in Argentina, who made this coalition with Alberto Fernandez, and basically a lot of people assumed that it was going to be a power-sharing agreement, that Alberto Fernandez would be like co-president and that Cristina would be co-president. But actually, she's kind of been given very few powers, very few responsibilities. And in fact, the people representative of her Kirchnerist movement, loyal to her, resigned from Fernandez's cabinet. So there's been this fight going on. I'm curious if you think that something similar could happen in Colombia, or if you think that Francia could actually have a very positive influence in the government.
It's complicated, and what you said about Argentina is pretty pertinent because it's true. I mean, but I believe that in Argentina it's worse. I mean, Fernandez won the presidency because of Cristina Fernandez, and because the Macri's government was like low-faring, politically persecuting Cristina, and the best things that they came out with was like, choosing another politician to run for president and having her as vice president formula. But she had more power actually than Francia Marquez in Colombia. Also, I believe that the figure of vice president, I believe not only in Colombia, everywhere, the figure of vice president is like decorative, is not so relevant, so important. But I still believe that Francia Marquez, that everything's gonna depend on how this connection between Francia Marquez and Gustavo Petro works. I'm optimistic. I want to think that Francia Marquez will be able to influence Petro in the decision-making process, but in reality, she doesn't have, as vice president, that big power to take decisions. So it's gonna be something that Francia Marquez is gonna have to work hard to build, like building this influence towards Petro in order to push him a little bit to the left. But as I told you, it's gonna be like it's like un juego de dados, we say in Spanish. I don't know how to translate that into English.
Yeah. So I do want to transition now and talk about sanctions. You, Jesus, you're Venezuelan. You live in Venezuela. You have experienced the difficulties of the U.S. blockade and economic warfare. The last time I interviewed you and had a discussion with you was, I think it was in 2019 or 2020. It was in Caracas, and it was at a time of very bad inflation. I mean, the inflation was in the triple digits and even higher. Now, actually, what's interesting is Venezuela has lower inflation than many countries in Latin America, including Argentina. So the government has been able to rein in the inflation, which is one of the biggest problems, which you can talk about. I mean, what that was caused by. It's a complicated story, but the U.S. sanctions, the attacks on the currency, these shady groups based in the U.S. like Dollar Today that were pushing up the black market exchange rate, and all the private corporations in Venezuela were refusing to use the government inflation rate, which just kept pushing it up. So that's a whole complicated thing. But the Maduro government has been able to put inflation under relative control. And now we've even seen that with the Western economic war on Russia and the US and European boycott of Russian energy, that Washington basically went to Caracas, and the Biden administration begged Venezuela for help with oil to make up for the lack of Russian oil exports. And we've seen that in return, the US government has lifted a few sanctions. Of course, the vast majority of the sanctions remain. The blockade remains. But I'm curious what you think about the Venezuelan government's handling of the economic crisis, and if you think that the U.S. lifting a few sanctions and potentially allowing Venezuela to export oil could mean that, the Venezuelan economy is really on the path toward recovery.
Yes, that's a good question. Uh, I believe that one of the important things, I mean, that I have to start saying that especially to our friends, leftist friends around the world, that Venezuela has been selling oil to the U.S. since 2000, since 1918 and 1920, something like that. Actually, Venezuelan oil industry was built by the U.S. because they wanted our oil. That's how it works in most of the countries that are oil producing countries. I mean, I'm saying this because a lot of friends of us in the left, whenever we talk about resuming selling oil to the U.S., they say, "No, you don't have to do that." But the reality is that Venezuelan economy depends on the consumption of oil in the U.S., in China, in different countries, and if we don't sell oil, our economy cries, as it has been crying since 2016-17, when the US sanctions began to be felt hard in Venezuela, and especially since 2019, when President Trump took the most radical sanction steps towards the country. So I believe that it's important to say that, because selling oil to the US doesn't mean, or to Europe, doesn't mean that we are becoming a neoliberal country or a capitalist country or something like that. And that also takes me to the your comments about Venezuelan economic recovery in recent months, especially since 2018, when President Maduro took the decision of uh, uh, releasing some of the economic constraints that the government had on certain aspects of Venezuelan economy. And that's also, that have created also another problem with some leftists out there that says that Maduro is becoming a neoliberal president, and they don't understand that we are doing that after several years trying to do a different economic approach that was not helping us, that was getting worse and worse with the coming of the sanctions. So in 2018, Maduro didn't have any other choice that find ways to liberalize the economy and to detached from previous economic advisors, and I was talking about that with you, Ben, before going live, and I really believe that Maduro, and before him Chavez, was following the advice of certain Venezuelan economists that were not taking us to the right place, that they were talking about, that they were saying that inflation was something imaginary, something that comes out of the imagination, and they were saying that price controls over the price of products was something good to do, and that salary increases were something that we need to do. And we went like, I don't know, like 7 8 years doing that, and the economy was getting worse and worse until the sanctions came and the economy exploded. So I'm happy that President Maduro took the decision of detaching from those advisors. That are several economists that are still out there right now criticizing the government more and aligning with the Communist Party of Venezuela, saying that Maduro is a neoliberal president or something like that, without taking into consideration the 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 material conditions that force him to take decisions that he still take. If I have some friends, some members of our team in Orinoco Tribune, that says that they don't like Maduro going abroad and calling for investments for Venezuela. That sounds too much like too neoliberal for them. But something that have to be understood as part of a very dramatic economic situation that we are still living. Some numbers has been getting better, as you say, like inflation, like uh, GDP growth, but also that GDP growth have to be analyzed very uh, in in depth, because yes, last year the economy of Venezuela grew, I believe, like 4 or 5%, but that happened after like 7 or 8 years of economic GDP decrease. And in those 7 or 8 years, the GDP of Venezuela shrank by 75%. That's a lot. Venezuelan economy in 2021 was only 25% of what it was in 2013. So you can imagine how an economy cries under those circumstances. And within that economy, the people, we, the Venezuelans that live here, have to deal with all the craziness that develops under those circumstances. As you say, inflation, deterioration of public services, mass migration that have a terrible effect in the life of a country. A lot of people talk about migration, but we in Venezuela have noticed how this mass sudden migration affects the country, because uh, usually the most prepared people are the ones that go abroad and decide to leave to emigrate, and that have an effect on the quality of services, the quality of education, the quality of government policies. A lot of things in a country can be affected if suddenly 1 or 2 million of the population, in the case of Venezuela, 1 or 2 million is like 5 or 7% of the population goes suddenly abroad.
Yeah, we call
So
that
it's
brain
complex.
drain. We call that brain drain, and we should keep in mind that those people leaving, they're disproportionate. They're not all, but they're disproportionately people who are educated, have backgrounds in medicine and engineering and these technical disciplines. And if you lose those people, it's much harder to have a functioning society.
Yes. So and what I mentioned that because I know that there's a lot of people that criticize in the left. That criticize Maduro's decisions, but I believe that most of the people in Venezuela, Chavistas or not Chavistas, are realizing that the decision that Maduro took in 2018, when he began to lift the controls on the exchange rate, lift the price controls over products that affect us a lot, because that created a scarcity issue that was never seen, and that was used widely by the mainstream media to attack Venezuela as a failed socialist, case, and start apply monetary discipline in order to try to control the amount of money circulating in the economy that put pressure on the inflation. When he decided to allow the use of dollars in Venezuela to deal with the scarcity of bolivars. I mean, we had a lot of problems between 2015 and 2017 and 18, and all of a sudden, with a different economic approach, Maduro has been able to deal with those things. But we are not in heaven yet. That's what I'm trying to say. But yes, the U.S. comes here when they realize that their sanction policy, the crazy sanction policy towards Russia, is backfiring, is having this boomerang effect that everyone is feeling and living all over the world, and they come here pidiendo cacao, as we say in Spanish, like begging us for oil, and that shows that how crazy the U.S. foreign policy is, and how erratic it is, and how lost the U.S. nomenclatura in Washington works. So we are happy because they came here. Some people in the left might not agree with us, but we are happy because that shows that we were right. That shows that our resistance was something, and that after resisting several years U.S. aggressions, the gringos came here con el rabo entre las patas, as we say. The Latino friend will understand that, but begging for oil. So that's something. But it's important to highlight what you say about not Venezuela, not. I mean, there's a lot of media coverage about U.S. lifting sanctions and easing sanctions towards Venezuela, but the reality is that until now, the only three real changes that I have noticed, and I try to follow that because that's part of the work that we do on the Orinoco Tribune, is that they allowed European corporations to uh, to to resume operations, and to Venezuela already have arrived some tankers from Europe. We had Eni and Repsol that operate in Venezuela for several years, and they were affected by U.S. sanctions. So what the U.S. did was, or FACT did was, to lift part of the sanctions towards those European companies to allow them to take Venezuelan oil to Europe, and that have a lot of sense because Europe is one of the regions also affected by their own crazy sanction policy towards Russia. And the other one was taking Malpica, Freddy or Felix Malpica. He's the cousin of the wife of President Maduro, Siria Flores, and he was put in the list of sanctioned individuals. And all of the sudden, last week, Felix Malpica, I believe that is his name, he was taken off that list, and that was big news in Venezuela last week, because especially through the right wingers, that they were saying, "Oh, look, they took Malpica out of the list," but I don't know what real implications that scene have in real life. But anyway, I mean, those are the only two measures that I have noticed, that I remember right now. The OFAC has been taking to really relieve some of the sanctions. A lot of people are saying that um, the the Chevron is going to have a similar measure taken soon, but up to now, Chevron is not exporting oil to sorry to the U.S. So maybe in the coming days, there's a lot of opacity towards those decisions, especially because they are taken by some bureaucrats in Washington, but also because mainstream media tries to advertise and play with those news to push right wingers, to push the Biden government to don't do anything, or in the contrary. So you notice that there is a lot of game playing with the lifting of sanctions towards Venezuela thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it has been a little overstated, although I think it's part of a trend, and the U.S. is lifting a few, although they're probably going to end up lifting more because they want to make up for the lack of Russian oil exports. And Russia had actually been one of the top exporters of oil to the United States, and especially to Europe, until this brutal economic war. One second, I had you muted because of the background noise. Go ahead.
And I just wanted to add that Russia took part of the share of Venezuelan exports to the US. It's a crazy move. Because I mean the Russians, and we don't see it bad. It's a natural thing in oil market. The Russians took part of the share of the Venezuelan oil that was not being sent to the U.S. because of the sanctions that they imposed on us, and now because they are imposing sanctions on Russia, they come here because they need the oil. But the problem also is that there are a lot of oil Russian companies producing oil in Venezuela. So at the end of the day, that's gonna be a big mess. You know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah, it's
Rosneft is here, so at the end of the day, they're gonna be helping the Russians if they buy Venezuelan oil. Of course, they are not gonna buy it from the Russian companies that are operating here, but at the end of the day, they're helping Venezuelan oil operation overall.
Yeah, well, this is what's funny about all of these U.S. sanctions and this economic war being waged by Washington is that they often do end up hurting the people in these countries, but strengthening the governments of these countries. And we see this very clearly in Russia. I mean, at least at first, the sanctions hurt the Russian people, although now their currency is significantly stronger than it was even before the sanctions. And now the Russian government is making more money on its energy exports because prices of energy commodities have skyrocketed, although that's led to inflation that's hurt people around the world. So anyway, whatever. That's a whole other long story, and we'll definitely talk about that in other other coverage here at Multipolarista. But I know that Jesus does not have a lot of time, so I just wanted to say on the subject of the economy before moving to Iran, where we're going to end our discussion. I wanted to say that from what I've heard from speaking with Venezuelans and reading the Venezuelan press, that I think what's also happening is that Maduro is getting a lot of economic advice from China, and the leftist critics of Maduro and the Venezuelan government who claim that they're becoming neoliberal is ridiculous. I mean, the government is still going to maintain control of the commanding heights of the economy, the oil sector, the significant, infrastructure, telecommunications, and all of that, transportation, but they do need to ease the brutal economic blockade on them. And the inflation has really destroyed a lot of wage increases. And if you're a country like Venezuela that doesn't have a global reserve currency like the dollar, and if your currency is not backed by oil because you can't export your oil because of the US blockade, or by other hard currency, then it leads to this massive inflation. So you constantly increase the wages for workers, which is a great thing, of course. We want workers to have higher wages, but then the inflation eats away at those wage increases. So it's this constant battle, and that was exactly what happened in Venezuela, where the government would constantly raise the wage, and then inflation would destroy those wage increases. It was a very difficult situation, and of course, I mean, the majority of these difficulties were caused by the illegal sanctions and blockade, but I mean, apparently China has had a lot of economic advisors helping to get over those problems, and now try to develop the economy with a model that still maintains state leadership in the economy, but also allowing certain sectors to invite foreign investment. And a lot of that foreign investment is not from, the imperialist West. It's from Iran and Russia and China. And specifically, I want to talk about Iran here, Jesus. President Maduro just took a historic trip to Iran this June. He also took a trip to Algeria and to Turkey, which is interesting, a NATO member, although Turkey constantly plays the West against China and Russia. Turkey's playing everyone against everyone at all times. But in Algeria, Maduro announced that they were working together to support Palestinians and support the people of the Western Sahara. And then he also took an historic trip to Tehran and signed a 20-year cooperation agreement between Venezuela and Iran. And Maduro announced that this will involve Iranian technological support for the Venezuelan oil sector and other Venezuelan technology. It includes technology transfers. It also includes medical support, and it includes economic agreements. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what this 20-year agreement between Iran and Venezuela could mean. This comes after Iran has sent many oil tankers to Venezuela full of lighter crude and oil diluents, which is what Venezuela needs in order to process the very heavy crude that Venezuela has. Because you can't just take the crude out of the ground and use it. You have to process it. And the U.S. blockade has made it very hard for Venezuela to get lighter crude and diluents. And furthermore, we know that Iran has even opened supermarkets in Venezuela. I think it's called Megasis. So maybe you can talk about the growing economic partnership between Venezuela and Iran and what you think about this 20-year historic agreement.
Yes, what you're saying is true. I mean, the relationship between Iran and Venezuela has been strengthening a lot in recent years, especially during these sanction times from 2017 until today. And one of the areas where the Iranians has been very most active, if you ask me, in my opinion, is the oil industry, and they has been key to us, especially since 2019 when we started to suffer gas scarcity all over the country. 2020 actually, when the pandemic began, and and um, the Iranians were the ones that sends oil tankers full of gasoline at the beginning, because we didn't have enough gasoline. Maduro said recently during the trip to Iran that the gasoline refineries in Venezuela were shut down, were not working, and that created a big problem. I mean, not having gas in a country is or diesel is terrible, not only for the people but for the economy. So the Iranians were the first that start sending oil tankers to Venezuela with gasoline, disregarding the fact that the U.S. was threatening on attacking those tankers, and actually at some point they seized like two or three of these tankers. But most of the tankers with gasoline finally arrived to Venezuela, and the U.S. Has not seized more tankers lately. But with that help, also the Iranian people, the Iranian government sent specialists, technical teams to evaluate the status of our refining facilities. And I have to say that those refineries were U.S. made. All the parts, all the technology, everything was built by the U.S. because we were a colony of the U.S. before Chavez came to power, like most of the countries in the region, and like most oil producing countries. So when the US start applying sanctions to Venezuela, of course the refineries were resent because we were not receiving enough. We were not receiving the parts needed to repair, to improve, to maintain all the refining facilities. So the Iranians came here, and they are still working, trying to change the platform, the technological infrastructure for Venezuelan petrochemical, facilities, and and that's gonna be very no, that's gonna be that is very important because we might get rid of that dependency from Iranian oil. Another thing that Maduro say when he was in Iran, and it has not received too much media attention, but we published it in Orinoco Tribune a few days ago, is that Maduro announced that General Soleimani, the Soleimani that was killed by the U.S. in a drone attack in Iraq like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, uh, immediately after the electrical blackout that we suffered in 2019, that was a heavy national blackout that affected Venezuela for several days, and that the government said that it was sabotage. Maduro, during his trip to Iran, says that General Soleimani and a group of Iranians came 2 or 3 days later after the blackout to help Venezuela with the blackout. And that he stayed in Venezuela for like 1 or 2 days, and immediately after he went back to Iran, he sent a group of experts to help Venezuela deal with the electrical crisis. I mean, those are the things that happens, and you only know a few years later when the authorities decide that it's time to release that information. But that's was something important because it talks about the level of relationships and brotherhood between Venezuela and Iran. And one have to say, and I'm putting it right now as Iranian helping us, but also at some point in 2009, President Chavez sent a lot of oil to Iran because they were suffering gasoline, I believe, to Iran because they were suffering some problems with gasoline production in Iran. And we know in Venezuela that Iranians also appreciate and value that help that Venezuela provided then to Iran. So we have a very nice and strong relationship that, of course, is being bombarded everywhere by mainstream media, by Zionist groups, by U.S. intelligence, by right wingers all over the world. And recently, we have this case of an airplane, 747, that is grounded in Argentina because they say that it was an Iranian plane and that a big crew of Iranians were in the a big group of Iranians were part of the crew, and that's part of the psychological smearing campaign that they always launch whenever the levels of relations between Iran and Venezuela is growing. So they initiate these campaigns against Venezuela and Iran, and that's something that is still happening. That situation with that cargo airplane from Venezuela company Emtrasur, which is a subsidiary of Conviasa. And that created a lot of headlines in the region, and it still is creating a lot of headlines in the region because some judges in Argentina went into the issue, and they seized not only the plane but also the crew, and they took their passports. So I don't know. I haven't read lately what is the latest status of the incident, but it's something happening right now. So it says a lot about the relationship between Iran and Venezuela, and President Maduro and I forgot the name of the current president of Iran, but the
Raisi,
president,
Ebrahim
uh-huh,
Raisi.
Raisi, signed this strategic 20 years strategic alliance, which I believe is something that comes very naturally. I mean, is something that is absolutely happening because of we have a very strong levels of relations right now with Iran, and we are aiming at strengthening that relation because it's good for Venezuela to have that relation. And also during the visit of President Maduro to Iran, the Iranians delivered a tanker, an oil tanker, part of a deal that was signed several years ago with Venezuela, when Venezuela bought 4 tankers from Iran. The first one was delivered like 2 or 3 years ago, and this is the second one. And we are talking about massive oil tankers being built in Iran, and that shows also the might of the Iranian economy. That besides, in despite of being also sanctioned as crazy for several decades already, they has been able to have this strong economy capable of building that kind of ships. So I believe that the level of relationship is getting stronger. Tourism was another issue that was discussed during Maduro's trip, and we are gonna open. Sorry, we're gonna open this. Um, Actually, the first flight of Conviasa between Tehran and Caracas was scheduled for this Saturday. So I believe that it already happened, but we are, the level of, I mean, Venezuela opened with Conviasa this weekly flight from Caracas to Tehran, and that's also part of the attacks that you now see that I was mentioning with this 747 plane being grounded in Iran, because that is the campaign that they usually launch, because they say that in these planes are gonna come terrorists from Iran, and they create this CIA, Mossad stories with a lot of uh, uh, movie Hollywood kind of information that you immediately realize that is bullshit. But anyway, they keep saying that, and they keep promoting those stories here and there, trying to smear Venezuela and Iran. But that's not going to happen. The relationship of Venezuela and Iran is getting stronger. Tourism is one of those elements that are part of the discussions. But I'm sure that security and defense is another one. But governments do usually do not talk too much about those things for obvious reasons. But that's also part of the relationship with Venezuela and Iran. And going back to tourism, a group of Iranian tour operators were coming to Venezuela. I mean, local news in Venezuela announced that a few days ago. So a group of tour operators from Iran are coming to Venezuela to evaluate the possibilities of promoting tourist packages between the two countries. And Venezuela is looking for that. Venezuela is in desperate need of income, and besides a possible resumption of oil operations, um, Venezuela needs to diversify its economy that was stuck in oil for several decades, not because we wanted that, but because the US uh, wanted us to be like that. And that's something that a lot of people blame the governments of different countries because of the economic model that they have, but no one talks about how the US shaped the economic world order after Second World War in order to have the economic world order that they wanted. And that's what we are seeing right now. And that's something that we are right now seeing that is cracking and that is falling apart. And I wish that that moment when the US is not the hegemon that control everything in the world comes to life. And I believe that's also part of your dream, and that's why you call your website Multipolarista, right, man?
That's exactly right. And this is the perfect segue, Jesus. I know it's already been an hour. I know you have to go, so you don't have a lot of time. So I have one final question, and you perfectly segued it. I wanted to talk about Venezuela's role in this emerging multipolar world. Venezuela's relationship with Iran is, I think, very much part of it. And, I wrote an article at Multipolarista multipolarista.com, about the 20-year cooperation plan signed between Venezuela and Iran. You can see President Maduro here with President Raisi of Iran. But I also mentioned in this article another article that I had written about Nicaragua signing a series of historic agreements with Iran. You know, Nicaragua, it's a much smaller country, only 6.5 million people, so this didn't get as much coverage as Venezuela's agreement. But it shows that there is this growing partnership between these countries in the global south. Iran and China in 2021 signed a 25-year cooperation plan estimated at $400 billion. $400 billion. So we're seeing the emergence of this axis of resistance, right? Not only in West Asia with the Lebanese resistance and Palestine and Syria and Iraq and Iran, but also that is kind of merging with the Latin American axis of resistance of Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. They're partnering with China and Russia. They're part of this group at the UN called Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. We saw in 2019, Venezuela hosted the non-aligned movement, Movimiento de los Países No Alineados, that was held in Caracas in 2019 at the peak of the US coup attempt. So Venezuela, in addition to being a leader of the left, it has become this kind of new voice of a global South cooperation movement, advocating regional integration in Latin America, but also South-South integration and South-South cooperation. So I'm wondering if we can just conclude with what your thoughts are about Venezuela's role in trying to build this new multipolar world. When Maduro gave a speech for the People's Summit of the People's Summit for Democracy in protest of the U.S. government-controlled summit, which was a complete disaster that the presidents of 8 countries in the region did not attend. In that speech that Maduro gave to the People's Summit for Democracy, he said that we are building a new multipolar world. So I'm wondering what you think about Venezuela's role in this process of not only resisting imperialism, that's one thing, but also trying to build a new political and economic architecture against imperialism.
That's true. That's true. Venezuela has been, since Chavez time, trying to build this multipolar new world order, and I believe that we have been successful doing that because, especially because of Chavez. Chavez was very insistent on this multipolar world. And Maduro, as his minister for foreign affairs for several years, and now as president is just replicating what the teachings of Chavez, and he believes in that, of course, and you can see that everywhere, but especially in these times, current times, with all the economic disaster that has been clearly seen during pandemic times in the West, in the US and Europe, with all this disruption in production chains all over the world, that they right now are blaming on China because China closed Shanghai for 2 or 3 weeks. But everyone knows that that's not the cause of the problem, because the problem happened a lot of months before that. And we now see the craziness inflation in the US and the effect that has in the US, in the interest rates that has been raised by the Federal Reserve in the US, affecting world markets. Markets everywhere. That's a sign that something bad is happening in the economic system designed and created and run by the US after the Second World War. And that system is cracking, it's falling apart for several years already, but we now are witnessing the whole thing happening in front of our eyes, and and I believe that what you are talking about Venezuela strengthening relations with Iran, but also Iran signing strategic alliances with China, but also China having strategic alliances with Russia. And a few days ago, there was this phone call between Xi Jinping and President Putin, where Xi Jinping reiterated his commitment with Russia. I mean, those are things that happen and sometimes are not covered by mainstream media because they don't reflect their imperialist narrative. But those things are happening, and countries are noticing that the US economy is about to crack and that they need to detach from the dollar war system that was created by the Bretton Woods institution in 47 and 48. I mean, those things are happening and we are witnessing, and I'm happy and honored that Venezuela is one of those countries that has been promoting the the emergence of this new approach towards international relations with a multipolar approach, and just to mention something that happened just a few days ago. I mean, this weekend in St. Petersburg, Russia, there was this international economic forum, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, where Venezuela had a lot of economic experts that met with Russian experts and Chinese experts to talk about ways to facilitate payments between our countries without the using of dollar. Venezuela announced during those meetings in St. Petersburg that the mere payment system that is used in Russia, especially after the Mastercard and Visa went out of the Russian market because of U.S. sanctions, is going to be used in Venezuela. I mean, Russians that comes to Venezuela for tourist reasons are going to be able to use their Mir cards in order to pay for anything that they want to pay here in Venezuela, and they won't have to need to have to use their cash. And those are the things that are happening right now. We have a lot of technology that can be used to in this sense to try to build alternative of that to the dollar, and that's going to be very important. I mean, I believe that the countries that detach from the dollar faster are the countries that are going to survive the imminent economic crisis that is going to come after the whole dollar economic model collapse. So I'm happy because Venezuela is, doing something to promote and to encourage this new world order, and that is part of the Chavista legacy, and I'm happy because of that.
Yeah, very well said. And I have to say that Hugo Chavez was so prescient when it came to this. This is an article, Chavez, the great integrationist and promoter of a multipolar world. It points out that in 1998, a year before he became president, winning a free and fair democratic election, although the fact that he won elections is ignored by the Western media, which calls him a so-called dictator. But Chavez said in 1998, quote, "The world of the 21st century that is already on the horizon, it will not be bipolar or unipolar. Thank God it will be multipolar." He said that in 1998. Just imagine the prescience of being able to see more than 20 years before. I mean, because it's only now that we're finally seeing the emergence of this multipolar world that Chavez helped give birth to. And I think that, yeah, you're right that, Venezuela, it plays such a key role in that historic process. And that's why, despite the difficulties that the Venezuelan people have suffered in the past few years, I think those difficulties will be seen as the birth pangs of a new world order. That's a reference to Condoleezza Rice, the neoconservative war criminal in the U.S. government, who referred to the U.S. imperialist wars in West Asia as the so-called birth pangs of the new Middle East. Well, the U.S. economic war on Venezuela and much of the world is the birth pangs of this new multipolar world. So I want to thank you, Jesús Rodríguez Espinoza, a great Venezuelan journalist, for joining us. I would highly recommend that everyone check out his website. It's called the Orinoco Tribune. He is the editor. He's very prolific. You can find that at orinocotribune.com. And Jesus, people who want to support Orinoco Tribune, can you tell them how they can support your work?
Yes, yes. First of all, before going there, I want to say everyone that I'm also a big fan of your work, man.
Thank you.
And you are a reference in the region for many, real leftist people. So please keep doing the work that you are doing because it's very important. It's very important, and especially coming from you that are a cadre, that are a person that is very well politically trained, and that's very important because when you don't have that training, a lot of things might happen. I mean, you can go sideways, so I just want to highlight that because it's absolutely true. You have a big fan here, not only with me but with all the Orinoco Tribune team, so that
Thank you,
always
Jesus. That
reads
means a
you.
lot.
Going back to the question that I already forgot. I mean, I now I remember. Go to Orinoco Tribune, and you can press the Patreon button. You can press the PayPal donation button. Right now, we sign an alliance with the Alliance for Global Justice, by the way, and we are like what they call tax exempt. I don't remember what is the name of the whole scene, but they are our fiscal sponsors. So anyone that wants to make a donation to Orinoco Tribune is going to have the tax deductions that happen when you donate to nonprofit in the U.S. So that's gonna we expect that might help us, improve the level of economic resources that we need, and we really need that. And you also know that, Ben, because you also work in an independent project, and we don't rely on advertisement, we don't rely in government support, so we only relied in the donations that we receive from our readers, and we usually are like up to the neck, not without resources, trying to do the best that we can do with not too many resources. So thank you for the invitation, Ben, and thank you for reminding me about the donation thing, because I always forgot to talk about those things. But those things are important because one have to eat. And
Exactly. Yeah. And so I guess I'll take this opportunity too, as to say as well, you should go to patreon.com/Orinoco Tribune, and you should support Jesus's work and his team. And you could also consider going to patreon.com/Multipolarista and supporting my work. And it's always a pleasure being joined by Jesus and other friends and comrades in Latin America doing great independent journalistic work. So this video will be available on YouTube and on Rockfin and on Rumble and on Odyssey. I have it backed up on all of those other video platforms in case YouTube ever, censors my channel. So this video will be available, and of course there will be a podcast available. So thanks, Jesus, and thanks to everyone
thank you,
else,
Ben.
and we'll see you next
Keep your
time.
good work. Un abrazo.
Igualmente.